Thank you very much, James, for your introduction. Is my voice heard? And I'm sharing my screen. Is that on? Okay. All right. Thank you very much again. My presentation and my focus today is about global Englishes and translanguaging for equality in language learning and language teaching. So I'm doing this from a sociolinguistic perspective. I apologize that my presentation is not 100% related to online teaching or technology, but again, hopefully we can learn from the presentation that how TESOL and how the field of ELT could probably be transferred from English only, from the ideology of monolingualism, to a more diverse linguistic and to embrace linguistic and cultural diversity. So I'm doing this from a global Englishes and translanguaging perspective. I will start with the very brief introduction of digital divide in education, followed by global Englishes and translanguaging, and I'll put forward some food for thought for language educators, policymakers, that how the field can move from monolingual ideology to multilingual language learning. Okay, so I guess that people nowadays are facing various challenges and difficulties, although we kind of get used to online teaching, but luckily in China we are doing face-to-face nowadays. But last year we experienced COVID-19, and online teaching suddenly came to our life. For many educators, we face those challenges, like how do we meet students' various needs and goals, and we face various challenges. So we will see some news that today, that currently many people are facing some challenges that they need to study online amidst COVID-19 pandemic. So we'll see the lack of resources. But we also need to think about, so here is a news report by the United Nations. We see that the COVID-19 pandemic has forced school closures in 191 countries, affecting at least 1.5 billion students and 63 million primary and secondary teachers, while in particular those teachers and students in low-income countries. In particular, nowadays, education equality and inclusion should be focused. So here is the heart of a response. So this is a tweet. And solutions to ensure learning never stops for the 1.5 billion students impacted by COVID-19 school closures. So this is something I called education divide. That this is a report published by OECD, that how language educators, teachers, and students face various challenges, the impact of the crisis on education, and how people respond to this. Okay, if you're interested in, the link is there, so you can read the whole report. While before I talk about my research interests and my presentation, we also need to think about when English is used as a global language, all right? English is used as a lingua franca. How do we promote multilingualism? So this is mother tongue-based multilingual education. While many contexts, many countries, in particular higher education, English is used as a key medium of instruction, while in many circumstances, the mother tongue has been erased and it's not allowed. So this creates education inequality from the linguistic and cultural aspect. So we will find a question here, if you don't understand, how can you learn? Children learn better in their mother tongue first. So my educational background was on global Englishes. So my PhD investigated people's attitudes on towards various accents and how they use English to project their identity, for example, in relation to ELT, okay, English language teaching. While some countries and some contexts are now promoting the mother tongue to be the medium of instruction. So it's very interesting. We will see English as a de facto global language used in many various contexts. But what is a more appropriate medium of instruction option to meet the various needs and goals for people? So we see the global Englishes versus medium of instruction, whether it's English as a medium of instruction or whether mother tongue should be used, should be promoted as the medium of instruction. All right. I'll start with a very brief introduction of the three diaspora of the spread of English. So the first diaspora said English as a native language with native varieties, while the second diaspora English as a second language with post-colonial varieties, while here people call it as a third, it's the English as a global language. Okay, I also recommend this book written by David Crystal if you are interested in the spread of English or English as a global language. Okay, so I think we're familiar with the first diaspora, that the first expedition from England to the New World was commissioned by here back in the 1584, while there was a failure, and then the first permanent English settlement dates from 1607. So here from the UK mainly to the US. So the groups of people in the two settlements had various regional, social, occupational, and linguistic backgrounds. So here we see the divide of northern and southern dialects. Well, again, it's the English towards the end of the 18th century, the continuing process of British world exploration established the English language in the southern hemisphere. So Captain James Cook visited Australia in the 1770s. So English was brought to Australia. While those marked the first diaspora, and the second diaspora, the spread and development of English as post-colonial varieties in Southeast Asia, South Pacific, and many contexts in West East Southern Africa. So those make English as a global language of instruction. So we will see that's how English is spread from the British Isles to the US and then to the world, marked by the first and second diaspora. And nowadays, English is used in many, many contexts as a medium of instruction, plays various roles and functions in people's daily lives. This is a three circles model proposed by Cattrall. I guess people are familiar with this one. If you are not, we'll see the inner circle, outer circle, and expanding circle mark the first diaspora. the second diaspora and the third diaspora. But nowadays, we need to recognize the dynamism and complexity of language context and education. So English is actually moving across borders. English is not limited while people using inner, outer, or expanding circle. But today, a social problem that for many sociolinguists, we're interested in seeing that while this model still puts native varieties as the center, and those periphery, in particular, we call the expanding circle, less developed countries context, we see the power and the dominant. Okay, that relationship is still quite salient. So while Kettle proposed the three concentric model, he argued that English acquires a new identity, a local habitat, and a name. English is now, as a consequence of its status, been associated with universalism, liberalism, secularism, and internationalism, which means that English does no longer belong to its native speakers, while the language users, people use English for various purposes, should be regarded as the owner of English. So think about language choice and education. Think about language use and education. In particular, if we reflect on the theme of the conference. Okay, so today, I guess that many online lectures are conducted in English. So English has been playing like another function, that's through online communication and technology as well. So this leads people to think about that when English is used as a global language, okay, how do people use language? For example, balance our native language, our linguistic resource, and English as a global language in education. So this is the global Englishes paradigm. That the paradigm covers world Englishes, English as a lingua franca, English as an international language, and translanguaging. Although some scholars may argue that translanguaging should stand on its own. Okay, anyway, I'm not going to explore some of the theoretical bits because I don't know, a recent book review published in TESOL Quarterly, the reviewers argues that for language practitioners, they don't really want so many terms. Okay, those terms are a bit complicated. I do agree. So I'm not going to talk about those theoretical bits, but we want to see, okay, language choice, linguistic power, linguistic inequality, and some people call this linguistic racism. That's from the dominance of English to multilingual use of English, to see how we recognize people's linguistic repertoire. Okay, so the first perspective is world Englishes. While that research area was developed in the 1980s, focused on the study of phonological and morphosyntactic features of post-colonial varieties of English. For example, Singapore English, Hong Kong English, Indian English. We'll see the phonological bit, for example, that Singapore English may pronounce milk, the dark L is not pronounced. There will say milk, for example, yeah? And morphosyntactic grammatical features in Singapore English, the use of lots of la or le or me, lots of particle, okay, influenced by Mandarin, yeah. So those varieties were codified. While later, in the 2000, people realized that English is not simply used within a certain community, such as Singapore English, such as Hong Kong English, Indian English, because when Singapore English is used outside the outside Singaporean people, for example, those varieties may create some issues on intelligibility. So English as a lingua franca focuses on the use of English across borders to see how people make meaning through negotiation, through various communication strategies, okay, through accommodation, for example. So English is positioned within a multilingual paradigm. While some scholars use another term called English as an international language, it's similar to ELF, but English as an international language focuses on teaching. Okay, so people call this teaching English as an international language. Again, I'll touch this briefly. Right? More recently, I think 2000, after 2000, 2010, 2015, another term called global Englishes. So people use the term as a more inclusive one, as an umbrella term, incorporating concepts of world Englishes, English as a lingua franca, and English as an international language, and or translanguaging. I put a question mark because still some people may not agree that translanguaging is part of global Englishes anyway. But we see the use of language in relation to education. So global Englishes, the field, extends the lens of world Englishes, ELF, and EIL to incorporate many peripheral issues associated with the global use of English, such as globalization, linguistic imperialism, linguistic racism, education, language policy, and planning. So hopefully, as language educators, especially when we teach online, we hold conferences online, and then when we communicate with students, with our colleagues, we'll think about our language choice. We'll think about whether, okay, the institutional policies, for example, whether we allow students to code switch, or whether we allow students to use, their first language. I think this will create huge debates. So many various debates in terms of language use, education language policy and assessment. So we talk about this creates a new great research area. Well, we see a new phase of English nowadays. English is one of the languages that used from a paradigm of multilingualism. Traditionally, we will see the power, we will see the dominance of English. So many people will put English at the top of the pyramid, that it has the power. We need to use English. Everyone should learn English. Okay, but from the paradigm of multilingualism, and especially the multilingual turn in applied linguistics, we may need to think about that. How do we regard English with other languages? Do we really want to sacrifice other languages to learn English and to use English? Do we really want to, in particular, our mother tongue, for example, the use of English, the dominance of English will create some other issues such as, language death, while it will lead to some cultural issues. So we are facing a new demographic trend, is that the current ratio of native speakers of English versus non-native speakers of English is around 1.4, even 1.5. So the use of English in people's daily communication is different from textbooks, for example, from dictionary, for example. And people do not really follow native standards when they communicate with other people. And people will also use their linguistic and their cultural resources, their multimodal resources to create meaning. So we also need to recognize the complexity and super diversity of language contact. This leads to, again, many terms. While scholars have various debates, the translanguaging, translingualism, macrolinguistics. Again, I'm not going to dig deep about the similarities and differences of those terms. But more importantly, I want to emphasize that global Englishes is a paradigm shift in research, teaching, and recognition of the current linguistic landscape and the sociolinguistic functions of English. It's a shift from monolingual framework to multilingual and multicultural framework and theories of English use. So think about the first picture and the first piece of news I share with you. While people are facing challenges, difficulties to have access on online teaching, while from this is a technology issue, for example, but again, how about the use of language? If they do not have access to English, the so-called de facto global language, they may also lose many opportunities. So I call this an education divide. Yeah. So before COVID-19, before the class, before online teaching, many people, the door is shut. Okay. But many people, if they do not speak proper, so-called proper standard English, they lose many opportunities to have access to many resources. So translanguaging is another research area that has been adopted to describe bi or multilingual speakers, complex language practices. So here, multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual worlds. It also embraces code-switching, first language use, multimodal, and further transsemiotic practices. We think about that language use in reality and language, the grammar or the textbooks that we are familiar with, that we are using for language educators, for teachers. To some extent, many textbooks create a distance by language users that many contents they learn from the textbooks cannot be used, or it's different. Those contents are different from what they are exposed in daily life. So translanguaging is very natural that people use their linguistic, cultural, multimodal resources in their language practice. So I show these two examples. The first one is about, I don't know, I don't really call this what language, because again, we'll see translanguaging, that language is a social practice. Language is performed. We don't really take it for granted that this is Chinese, or we don't really take it for granted that this is Japanese, or this is English, for example. So we'll see a combination of scripts, images, etc., to create meaning. Okay, so I guess that people are able to understand from those images. We know the meaning can be, conveyed. So we'll see that people understand language from a traditional aspect to recognize language as a practice, language as a performance. So here we have languaging, that the language is performed, while translanguaging is above, okay, languaging. So the prefix we see here, trans, so translanguaging is a cognitive, psychological, social, linguistic, practical theory of language. So translanguaging is about communication. Focus is more on communication, not language itself. So here from Global Englishes and from translanguaging, we'll really need to reconsider what the so-called, what the standard is, what correct language is, and what mistakes is. For example, for language teachers, educators, TESOL practitioners, how do we create rooms for language users, for example, or are we willing to create rooms? How about the different purposes? It really depends on different purposes. It depends on different contexts. And how much room do teachers create for our language users, language learners to translanguage, for example? Okay, we don't really want to go to one extreme. We don't really want to go to another extreme, of course. So those questions are related to language policy, language teaching, and language assessment. In particular, if we are doing online teaching, sometimes as teachers, we don't really control, okay, language use by students. So I don't know whether online teaching teachers will create more room for students using of translanguaging or not, okay? So language policy and language practices are becoming more subtle, I mean, for the online teaching processes. Okay, so translanguaging from the monolingualism aspect to multilingualism, language in contact to create new meanings. So again, here we focus on the meaning making process, how message can be conveyed, not through language as codes itself, but through various aspects, through various resources, various channels. Okay. So we see here the perspective of languaging also challenges the concept of named languages. So we don't really take individual languages. We don't really see this as individual languages. But here we revisit, also people revisit the traditional hierarchy and superiority of the Anglophone varieties of English. Again, we don't really put, okay, position language at the pyramids to see the various power, the various issues. So English language teaching should move, okay, from the coloniality to locality. So here the argument is that ELT should recognize the locality rather than simply reinforcing the ideology of coloniality. Okay, think about the second diaspora. Nowadays, English is used in a very, very complicated way that people cannot really control, all right? So that aspect, we really want to empower teachers, educators, before they empower students. But to some extent, we'll see the initiative arguing the importance of incorporating various aspects of global Englishes into classroom teaching. Actual ELT practices seem to be relatively slow to reflect on global Englishes and translanguaging. And the entrenched ideology of native speakerism is still salient in both job markets and classroom practices. So I would say that English is mostly regarded as the property of its native speakers. Many teachers, students have those mindset that they need to follow a certain standards. Again, because they need to pass certain exams, they need to follow certain policies, and again, money-making purposes. So the top-down language policy and also the need of the social market may create, still reinforce the native speakerism ideology in ELT. So some scholars argue that those ideologies and practices that are utilized to conform or normalize and reformulate an unequal and uneven linguistic power between language users, including first language use and accent, will create something called linguistic racism or linguistic inequality. Okay, this was from Dolphin, and some scholars argue argue that like linguicism. Okay, Phillips also proposed linguistic imperialism, although I'm not 100% agree. Yeah, we need to see that ideologies and structures which are used to legitimize, effectuate, and reproduce unequal division of power and resources, both material and non-material, between groups which are defined on the basis of language. Okay, so from the linguistic aspect, from language aspect, from cultural aspect, and from the resources that people enjoy through during COVID-19, for example. So to some extent, online teaching, people also need to think about, especially educators, we need to think about how do we promote equality? How can teachers provide more resources for our students, in particular in those economic less developed places, for create education equality for people? Okay. So again, linguistic racism, this needs to be historicalized and examined in relation to the socio-political contexts in which multilingual speakers are embedded. And also it has to be examined in conjunction with vitally important and adjacent work on linguicism, native speakerism, and racial linguistic. Again, I'm not going to explore those bits. People already published a lot on those aspects. But for language educators, again, think about our own contexts. What can be done to create opportunities, resources for people? In particular, I know many students are doing online learning, and teachers were doing online teaching. It's not an easy job, because based on my experience, I ask students, okay, to search online, you've got lots of resources that you can do. But students simply do not know, okay? Not because they don't have that resource, but because they don't have those, what we call the technology, those online literacy, that they don't know how to search information, let alone those who do not have internet access, let alone those who live in remote areas that they don't have access to the internet. So I read some pieces of news that I really feel sad. In China, one student does not have a laptop, does not have computer at home. So what she had to do was to carry a mobile phone to a market, to an open market, to have internet connection and to have online teaching at a very small vendor, very shabby place, to have online learning. Well, we see many stories in that case. So again, it's very difficult to solve in one day, right? So I talk about from a language, from a linguistic aspect, that language educators, what can we do? But again, this is another story, even though for well qualified citizens with foreign degrees, this is the expatriates. And that story um, narrated by a student of Kumarava Devalu. That paper was published in TESOL Quarterly. Okay, so Professor Kumar described an experience by his students. I think an Indian student completed a PhD degree in the US, well qualified. Okay, PhD. So the student was crying in front of her professor, mentioning that it's difficult for even well-qualified citizens with foreign degrees to compete with expatriates. And if they do manage to get a job at an institution of their liking, their salary and service conditions are not on par with those of the expatriates, nor do they enjoy the same respect and recognition accorded to native speakers. So they are local people, yeah, local educators. They are treated as second-class citizens in their native lands. Again, again, this is a case. We don't really want to take it for granted that this happens everywhere. But this is a story, okay, a real story for people who obtained their degrees in foreign countries and they want to return to their home country to look for a job to compete with expatriates. Again, that story. Okay. The power of English, because simply, okay, I don't use English as my first language. People do not enjoy this so-called privilege that I use English as my native language, for example. So people also argue people also put forward this phenomenon as unequal Englishes about the politics of English today. So any discussion of English as a global language and its socio-educational implications, therefore cannot ignore the fact that far from being a solution to the dismantling of the unequal power relations in the world, English is, in fact, often part of the problem. Okay, so I don't know whether this is a good analogy when we use the power of English and the power of technology. All right, we use English as a medium of instruction, as our resource, and then technology. Okay, that's digital literacy, the digital divide. That may also create certain inequality, okay, for many people. So again, those are the problems, those are issues that language, not only language, but educators, we need to deal with, all right? To challenge, for example, from a sociolinguistics perspective, to challenge native speakerism proposed by Holiday. Holiday. So it's about the belief that native speaker teachers represent a Western culture from which spring the ideas both of the English language and of English language teaching methodology. So the ideas from the West. So it's seen instead as a divisive force which originates within particular educational cultures within the English-speaking West. So in order to promote educational equality nowadays and the use of language, applied linguists start to move from the theories and methodologies from the West. They start to focus on so-called global South, okay, to empower those economically less privileged places and people, that how they enjoy, okay, linguistic, the not only linguistic cultural resources, but resources in various aspects. Okay, I'm sorry, I just My research in the Chinese contexts, I also found English language teachers, ELT teachers' privilege and marginalization. It's again very difficult for them to make their voice heard. So from my data, Chinese local English teachers mention about some professional job requirements. They need to get a PhD in order to compete with native English teachers. Mostly they will have an MA, for example. So PhD holders will compete with MA holders, and as long as, especially when they have the job, many Chinese English teachers could not enjoy the same pay scale and also the remuneration, even with the same educational background and working experience and housing conditions as well. So the Chinese teachers, when they teach at the university, they need to pay their own housing, while for expatriates, the university simply offer free housing service for them in order to attract them to work. And here, the job markets, many job advertisements, we see that native speaker only, while the door is shut for many non-native speakers of English. Okay, so my own interview data, I found that one participant mentioned that this will strangle the professional identity and personal endeavor of Chinese English teachers, and non-native English teachers will no longer have a say in this field, which is a grievous and realistic concern, while native English speakers have a higher face validity. Again, think about professional development. I just echo the previous presentation. How do we really make our voice heard, especially for many non-native English teachers? Okay, so what counts as a professional identity? All right, so for English language teaching, this should be more contextualized, as not only should people view English language teaching from a global perspective, but also the localized versions of English, or from a local perspective. That's why I see we need to break the coloniality of ELT and to focus on the locality, local needs, and local voice, okay, to reflect upon the current linguistic landscape of English across the world. Kuma's story, okay, the student's story, well, he also argued that by their uncritical acceptance of the native speaker dominance, non-native professionals legitimize their own marginalization. Both the process of marginalization and the practice of self-marginalization bring to the fore the coloniality rather than the globality of the English language. They cast a long hegemonic shadow over the activity of TESOL. Again, during COVID-19, we also need to think about how do we balance language use, students' needs, and students' teaching goals. Apart from language use, right, those also create many challenges for educators. Okay, the center and the periphery, that is a gap. Okay, I see the center of the native speaking countries, while the periphery, those people need to learn English before they acquire their subject knowledge, for example. Okay. I'm also going to show some stories, some linguistic landscape. Okay, I'm not going to read the definitions. I took some pictures, very interestingly. One is at a CIL called Center for Independent Language Learning. Okay. Well, this is a language policy, says that foreign languages only. Well, when people enter the room, first language is not allowed, it's erased. Okay, so this is a place with all the so-called foreign languages. So I took the picture here. It says, kindly keep all conversation still in foreign languages. I know this is a place called Center for Independent Language Learning, but okay, the policy, okay, this is more overt than covert, that you are not allowed to use your first language. Let's move on. I also took this picture. Okay, I speak English, Wall Street English, and again you see here that follow a British English standard, right? So here means learn English for your future. Okay, and what English should be learned, for example. So the tongue, we see the British. You need to learn British English. People should speak British English. Okay, another picture here says you master, quickly master, right? Master pure English quickly. And I like this. I use this picture a lot as an example where people can see the language and symbolic power. Okay, in terms of gender, in terms of the dressing codes, we'll see that, and in terms of how people are tied to each other. Okay, that's, I don't know, lots of interpretation of this picture. Okay. So the tension between retaining the culture and values associated with the mother tongue and the adoption of a national identity symbolized by a foreign language is not easy to reconcile. How to bridge? Yeah, this is a question. It's very difficult to say, yeah, in one day or by individual. So that is a story I cannot, this is a question I cannot really answer either. Okay. But those are research interests, translanguaging, all right. Global Englishes, again, some of the principles, time limits, I'm not going to explore. I'll present why do we need translanguaging amid COVID-19, that people's linguistic language, first languages, their linguistic resources should be recognized. Okay, we really need to challenge the native oriented and native speakerism ideology in ELT. We need to understand the various issues of language and identity, power and equality from a socio-linguistic lens. And also in terms of language, in terms of pedagogy, in terms of language policy, right? We also need to provide a more comprehensive picture of classroom discourse to examine how stakeholders deal with the tension between the rigid English-only policy and the students' practical language needs in classroom practices. Okay, face-to-face or online teaching, those should be considered. I'm not going to explore those two cases. So I myself conducted more than two. Yeah, I published these two papers. If you're interested in, one was in ELT Journal and another was in Lingua. The first one was on global Englishes. Then the second one was on translanguaging. Time limit, I'm not going to elaborate the findings, but we'll see here the summaries of the findings. We found that despite the English-only policy, the teacher participants utilized translanguaging strategies to facilitate content teaching, including concept, language point explanation, comprehension check, and content knowledge localization. So teachers use translanguaging to empower students. I don't know whether it's conscious or unconsciously, okay? Or whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, but students are empowered. And teachers show different positions towards translanguaging. The teachers in favor of translanguaging strategies recognize more functions of translanguaging practices. There are some challenges. The influence of the monolingual policy, as well as students' overuse of L1. Yeah, so those needs to be researched, further researched. Some of the implications that for language educators, we'll see that the role of English, okay, we use English as a global language. It does not mean that the mastery of English only would naturally lead to optimal outcomes in terms of content subject learning and enhancement of English language proficiency. So we need to, as language educators, as teachers, they are advised to learn more about the new trends in bilingual or multilingual education to broaden their perceptions and accept a multilingual view. And also, the adoption of English as a language of instruction should be contextualized as language policymakers should reconsider the feasibility and availability of the necessary resources for EMI English as a medium of instruction to understand first language use and local cultures as resource in order to promote translanguaging pedagogies and challenge linguistic inequality and racism. Okay, so to build a TESOL field that wholly embraces and builds upon the dynamic cultural and linguistic repertoires of our students across contexts. So a multilingual lens, reconsider the monolingual bias, adopt a sociolinguistic perspective, respect linguistic and cultural resources as people's repertoire, and recognize students' first language use as language resource and allow translanguaging as a natural linguistic practice. Again, it depends on various contexts. We don't take this for granted either. So I want to really end with my talk that global Englishes and translanguaging research and use for an anti-racist pedagogy. So those address the intertwined nature of race and language teaching, support both students and teachers in recognizing and making visible the racialized nature of language. So this is a question for people to think about, especially language educators, no matter we are doing face-to-face teaching or we are doing online teaching. So can this unbroken circle of intimidation, linguistic discrimination, linguistic racism truly not be broken? Or do we like things the way they are? Language serves as a convenient excuse to turn away. Are we willing to consider a nation in which the cost of success is achievement measured by other fairer means? So language subordination is about taking away a basic human right to speak freely in the mother tongue without intimidation, without standing in the shadow of other languages and peoples, to resist the process passively or actively is to ask for recognition and acknowledgement. It is a demand for the simple right to be heard. Some other quotes that here, language is a practice that constructs and is constructed by the ways language learners understand themselves, their social surroundings, their histories, and their possibilities for the future. In particular, okay, think about for language educators, how do we empower students through online teaching? And for language users, for language educators, we also need to realize that we are never just teaching something called English, but rather we are involved in economic and social change, cultural renewal, people's dreams and desires. Okay, another post that global Englishes and translanguaging as a socially just pedagogy. So it's important that we should know about translanguaging here. Thank you very much. Okay. Linguistic racism on language assessment. Yeah, it's true. And I think this is also a key aspect that when we promote global Englishes, we promote translanguaging, is very difficult to change the field of assessment. Still, students, when they want to pass certain exams, will see language assessment is regarded as a gatekeeper. So this is still the gatekeeping practice. While I don't know that people you may feel when they enter a new environment, study abroad, they realize that language used by people is very different from what they have been tested, for example. Okay, for many Chinese students, they don't even know how to order. They don't even know the name of the vegetables when they go shopping. But those are not tested. Okay, they are tested the academic skills, which again may not really fit what they are going to learn. For example, I'm going to learn mathematics, or I'm going to learn engineering, but they need to test in the exams, astronomy, for example, or some other subjects. They pass a certain exam, whatever IELTS or TOEFL, but again, it's not based on what they're going to learn their subject major. And I know it's very difficult, and it's also very challenging for test takers, for test designers as well. Yeah, the thing in Turkey,